Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very important relationship, and that's the U.S. Mexican relationship. Our guest today is expert on this topic. Dr. Tony Payan is Executive Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. His most recent book is U.S. Mexico Relations, Structuring Alternative Futures. Dr. Tony Payan, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Happy to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's just take it right from the top. What is the main thrust of your book, the U.S. Mexico Relations?
Well, you know, we like to predict the future. We like to think about the future here at the Baker Institute at the center. And we called on a number of experts on all kinds of issues. As you know, the U.S. Mexico relationship is very, very complex. There's issues that have to do with climate change and water exchanges, energy sales, trade and economic integration, a very complicated immigration landscape, issues that have to do with politics and diplomacy, lots of issues, security, of course, fentanyl and all those kinds of issues. And so we said, well, let's call the experts, the individuals who know a lot about each of these issues to the table. We sat around the table, and then we decided that we were going to use a specific methodology known as strategic foresight. That is essentially a methodology that contemplates the cone of the future, so to speak. If you want to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, it's probably a lot easier than if you want to predict what's going to happen in a year or 5 or 10 or 50 or 100. It's a very specific methodology. We asked the authors to apply that methodology to their expertise, to choose the variables that we think are going to determine the shape and the state of the binational relationship in the next 5 to 10 years, and then in their area of expertise, of course, and then to generate from there various scenarios for the binational relationship. And that's the book. It's very coherent. The methodology is very specific, and these are all the issues that we thought were relevant to the U.S.-Mexico binational relationship.
Very good. And before I forget it, let me mention your website at the Baker Institute is www.bakerinstitute.org. And this Baker Institute, I guess, was named for Jim Baker. Is that correct? James Baker?
That's right. That's right. You know, when Mr. Baker retired in 1992-93 from the administration, he came to Houston, back to Houston, really. And then some scholars and academics at Rice asked him to, help usher a new place to think policy at Rice University. And so they decided to found the Baker Institute. Mr. Baker is still here, and he's still very active, and he is still the chairman of the board of the Baker Institute.
Oh, is he? My goodness. Yeah, interesting. Very good.
He's about 94 now. He's going to be
I was going to say he's getting up there.
And still very sharp, very active, and a sharp mind. I think probably one of the more consequential foreign policy figures in the U.S. government in the second half of the 20th century.
Without a doubt, no doubt about that. That's for sure. Yes. Well, very good. Well, you mentioned the methodology. You brought together these experts, and these were experts like one on environment, one on migration, one on trade. That's how you did it. And then they created like an alternative futures scenario, like a futuristic type of thing. And that's how you came together with your concepts and your ideas.
Yes, but it wasn't about, taking out a crystal ball and thinking about, what some magician, some force was going to tell you that the future was going to be. I think the methodology dictates for a very rigorous exercise in which you pick the number of things that are going to matter. For example, take trade. What's going to matter on trade? Obviously, in 2017 to 2020, then President Donald Trump, now president-elect again, decided to review trade. We know the rise of China had an effect on views on trade in the world. We know that there's a lot more skepticism about globalization and trade and economic integration. We know that there was a a very concerted effort to implement a new industrial policy to protect the economy from unfair trade. That's the way the world is going. So we asked the authors, think about the variables, the kinds of things, leaders that are coming up, changes in the ideological environment, specific policy actions that are being taken by each of the countries, and then apply a value. You know, if Kamala Harris had won the election, this would be the scenario. Trump won the election, we're probably going to go back to a continuation of his policies. And so they apply that to reality, and then they said, well, if Trump wins, this is what's going to happen. If he doesn't win, this is what's going to happen. These are the policies that U.S. is implementing. This is how we expect China to respond. And then based on that, you sort of project the cone of the future. Obviously, the further the horizon, the greater the uncertainty. But the closer the horizon, I think, the more certainty you have on who the leaders are going to be, what policies are being passed, implemented. And of course, you can generate sort of 3 different scenarios. A computer can generate millions of scenarios, of course. You can apply AI and generate a lot of different scenarios with lots of data, lots of different variables. We're human. We can only work with 3 or 4 scenarios at a time. So we asked the authors to think about an optimistic scenario, a sort of a probable scenario, kind of middle of the road, and then of course a collapse scenario when everything just falls apart. And they did a very good job.
That's the thing that I'm thinking of right now when I think about the Trump trade policies in particular. First off, let me ask you, before I go too far, Mexico is still the U.S.'s #1 trading partner. Is that correct? Or
as an individual country, yeah. If you look at the numbers, I think Europe as a unit is the largest trading partner, but as individual countries, of course, that would be Mexico, and then that would
Canada.
Be China.
Yeah, it used to be Canada for years, but I think Mexico's bumped Canada out of #1 spot. But you were talking about trade, and some people, especially the Wall Street people, are very concerned about Donald Trump's promises to put a 60 to 80% tariff on so many goods coming in, not only from Mexico, but also from China and probably from the European Union. And he even threatened to put a 200% tax on John Deere tractors that are produced in Mexico. How did that factor in, and what would be the effect of that particular decision?
We have to be careful when we examine a particular policy, let's say an increase in tariffs, because when you move one piece, I think many other pieces move at once. So let's say that you impose a tariff on steel, which is exactly what happened.
Which has happened, right?
It happened during the first Trump administration. Of course, President Biden decided not to lift those tariffs. He kept them very much in place, which tells you at the end of the day that there is a consensus, a policy consensus in the United States coming from both sides of the aisle. Republicans and Democrats are both now on the same side, more protectionist, considerably more protectionist attitude towards trade. Partly because obviously they feel that China cheated and such things. But if you impose, tariffs on steel, obviously steel goes into cars, it goes into appliances, it goes into many of the things that we use on a daily basis. So if there is on a simplistic basis, I guess, if there is a tariff, the tariff gets collected by the government at the entry point by customs. And then, of course, the product comes in, it gets deployed into various manufacturing facilities, and the price just gets added to the cost of the good, the production of that particular good, and then ultimately to the consumer. Maybe some companies will absorb that and will only increase the prices based on a smaller percentage than the tariff will cost, or maybe they'll just pass the entire cost to the consumer. So it could cause inflation. It could certainly protect U.S. companies. Many of them may actually make more things inside the United States because they can now buy steel at the same price from U.S. steel mills. But at the end of the day, kind of makes the industry less efficient, heavier, more expensive, and even may create inflation depending on how much of that is transferred. So it's a very complicated scenario. I'm simplifying it here. But tariffs are probably not the way to fight, especially if they're 60, 80%. You may create more problems than you're solving. Maybe 5, 10%, may not hurt. The government is not even going to collect that much money. The U.S. already has very low tariffs in the world. It's one of the lowest tariff countries in the world. So who knows? I think Mr. Trump will have to be very careful not to overdo it, because then we'll all pay it at the supermarket,
Right.
the car
That's
dealers.
right. That's exactly right, because the customer normally, if the company doesn't absorb the increase, the customer will pay it. It is
That's right.
not paid by the shipping country or the country of origin. That is not going to happen. But as you mentioned, that a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle are favorable towards tariffs, but most of them are for selective tariffs, just very focused. Whereas he was talking about a broad-based approach
Right.
to slapping 60 to 80%, which a lot of the people on Wall Street are saying that could lead to a trade war. It could lead to a recession, a depression, another Smoot-Hawley
Correct.
situation that caused the Great Depression. And we're going to come back and talk about all that good news in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. There are many important relationships that the U.S. has with countries all around the world, but one of the most important is with Mexico. And today we're talking about the U.S. Mexican Relations with Dr. Tony Payan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. His most recent book is U.S. Mexico Relations, Structuring Alternative Futures. We were talking a minute ago, Doctor, about the trade situation. And what has been the reaction in Mexico up to this point? You really don't know what's going to happen until it happens, but you can still speculate a little bit because of campaign promises or threats or whatever came out on this. But how would Mexico react if he put a 200% tariff on John Deere tractors, which would cost a farmer here in this country $500,000 for a tractor? How would that? How are they dealing with that?
Well, I mean, Mexico, I think, is right now a little bit stunned. They really didn't expect Trump to win the elections, even though the elections were always very close to call. So there was no surprise, really. It could have gone either way. It went the way of Mr. Trump's. And I think the Mexican government is also fairly new. They just took office in October last month. They're still trying to figure out and get some traction. I think the Mexican government is divided at this point, even though they give the impression that there is a semblance of unity because there is a dominant political party, Mr. López Obrador's political party that he founded in 2014. And then, of course, his successor, Claudia Scheinbaum, who took office last month. But the team is not that good. I don't think it's a very competent team. They've lost a lot of technical folks. They've lost a lot of folks who understand the reality of economics. And I don't think they've processed exactly what's coming. What's coming. I think they can hear the rumbling of the train on the tracks, but they can't see it just yet. They're going to be surprised. And I think they came out. The first reaction was, well, we'll also impose tariffs on American goods. The supply chains between the two countries are so integrated. Trade is now reaching $850 billion a year, of which almost 50% is intra-firm trade. By that, of course, I mean Mexican companies and American companies in Mexico are buying parts in the U.S., taking them into Mexico, finishing the product, bringing the product back into the U.S. So these are fully integrated supply chains, and I think that a tariff war would not be convenient. And for Mexico to just casually say, we'll respond slapping tariffs on American goods is also kind of risky because, like you said, we've seen it in the 1920s and we know where it led, really. So I think it's probably not a good response, even if Mr. Trump imposes tariffs 5, 10, 20%, whatever he wants.
Right. It seems that most economists, conservatives, liberals, whatever, everybody in between, have come to the conclusion a tariff war, a trade war, would not be in the best interest of of the world, and would definitely lead to a recession, maybe a depression, and that's what we have to be concerned about. But you mentioned the new incoming president, Claudia Scheinbaum, and her administration, and how she's lost a lot of technical
Yeah.
expertise, and that's a concern here in the United States right now because Mr. Trump has promised to eliminate 50,000 knowledgeable public employees and put in his own loyalists in their place. And in all probability, some of them may be qualified, but in all probability, you're going to get loyalty to Mr. Trump, and they will not know the issues and will not know the topics. And we can see that from some of the appointments up to this point of how little knowledge that they have of the appointee to the Department of Defense to national intelligence, just on several. You know, some of them are very good, but others are not. They just do not have the knowledge and the background, and they're not qualified in the eyes of the majority of the people in this country. And it's going to be extremely important that he get it right on this because we could have a lot of problems. Well, let's focus on migrants. What is going to be, how is Mexico dealing with the situation, the migrant situation? I know they've worked with the previous Trump administration, with the Biden administration, and now with the incoming Trump administration. What do you think their approach will be to dealing with the migrant crisis, really?
I always thought that the immigration crisis on the border was really a serious issue. There were too many folks making their way through Mexico, coming up to the United States. This has been going on for a while. I remember June 2012, I think, 12 years ago, over 12 years ago, the first migrant caravan. By a caravan, I mean, when thousands of people all of a sudden just swarm together, congregate, and then begin the march, usually on foot, but sometimes, on trains and other means, and make their way to the border to ask for asylum. Most of these folks obviously were turning themselves in to U.S. authorities asking for asylum, many of them being processed at the border, giving an NTA, a notice to appear before an immigration judge. That sort of backlogged the immigration judge, the immigration court system. And I think it was unsustainable. The U.S. Asylum system wasn't made for that. It was really made, for communist refugees from the old Soviet Union. It was made to process very few people, and it just simply was overwhelmed when millions of people, hundreds of thousands a month, would show up at the border. That our system is just not made for that. So that was a crisis that we saw here in Texas. We saw it in California. We saw it. It kind of moved around in different parts of the border. I think it happened under Obama. It happened under Trump. Biden, of course, made the mistake of sending the wrong message in the beginning. So more people came. Eventually, he got a hold of it, but not without Mexico's help. Most of these migrants were, of course, showing up at the U.S. Mexico border, transiting through Mexico. In December of 2023, the administration finally met with the Mexican authorities and agreed to kind of close Mexico to a lot of those people that were just coming into the country. So Mexico imposed new visas on certain nationalities to contain people coming into Mexico. It deployed the National Guard to detain a lot of these migrants. In some months, Mexico deported more migrants than the United States, and the flows have come down. I think we're about 30, 40%, a little bit more manageable. That's why you don't see it on the headlines of newspapers. So I think it's kind of under control. But Mr. Trump has gone further, of course, and has said that's not enough. Mexico has to continue to cooperate on immigration, or we will close the border, we will impose tariffs. And on top of that, we will also deport the 10 million undocumented residents that are currently present within U.S. territory. So he's gone a little further. We'll see where that goes. But Mexico is a key piece to contain that crisis. We saw it this year in 2024 after Mr. Biden negotiated that agreement with Mexico and, of course, issued some changes to the asylum system in May of 2024. It made a difference. We'll see what Mr. Trump does. But at this point, what Mexico did very well, I think, for their political purposes, was to confine the binational relationship to immigration. As long as Mexico cooperated on immigration issues, I think the United States was happy to let go of many other things, including trade, including fentanyl, drugs, many other issues, democratic backsliding in Mexico itself. So the U.S.-Mexico relationship was essentially confined to that one issue, where it's a very complex relationship, and we need to look at it with a much broader frame of issues on the table. We need to look at everything together. And so I think Mr. Trump has already said 4 issues will matter: immigration, fentanyl and organized crime, trade, and of course, Mexico's alignment of its foreign policy with Cuba and Venezuela and other countries that the U.S. does not have a good relationship with. So Marco Rubio, if he becomes the head of the Department of State, has already said that he's going to create a coalition of more conservative leaders in Latin America. And surely that will rub right against the U.S.-Mexico relationship because Mexico has taken a turn towards the left, I guess, and that's not going to go well. So it'll be very complex in the next year. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. And also with Lula in Brazil and some others, in fact, that may rub badly with many leaders in Latin America, not just with the Mexican leaders. So it'll be interesting to see. Or I can't believe we're just about out of time, but let me ask you the last minute or so. I hate to do this. There's so many stereotypes that people have of each other. People in the United States have of Mexicans, Mexicans have of the United States. What are 1 or 2 quickly stereotypes that Mexicans have of the U.S. and that U.S. people may have, or some people may have of Mexicans or Mexico?
Yeah. When we think about each other, I think a good exercise is to ask people to respond to a question or respond to a particular prompt and then ask them what comes to mind, right? What's the first word that comes to mind? And then you create clouds of words to see how people, what people are really thinking about. I think when you talk to people in Mexico about the United States, the first things that appear is drug addicts, drug consumption, weapons flowing into Mexico, kind of guns run amok in society, lots of, I guess, really serious gun events in the United States, power and economic power and things like that. That comes to mind. Those are some of the more negative stereotypes. Obviously, there's also an admiration for the way of life and liberty and such. Of course, Trump doesn't really help much the U.S. image. We saw it in the first term. He really didn't help U.S. image. The U.S. lost a lot of really cultural and sort of reputational capital. We'll see how that goes this time. When Americans think about Mexico, there are some good positive things. They think about culture. They think about the beaches. They think about, good, hardworking people. I think that's some stereotype that's gone away. The old image of the Mexican sitting under a cactus taking a nap, that's long gone. Everybody knows that Mexican migrants work very, very hard and produce a lot and contribute. But there's also drugs. There's also fentanyl. There's also immigration coming through Mexico. There's also a very restive, difficult border to manage. So all those are kind of images that you hear when you talk to people, obviously.
That's very, very true. And I'm glad you mentioned those because those images, luckily, are changing in a positive direction. But with the migrants in particular, if Donald Trump does deport a large number of migrants, especially from the agricultural areas around the United States, you're going to see agricultural prices soar, which is going to create more inflation. Prices for a head of lettuce or a bucket of cherries or something like that will go out of sight. So
Yep.
this has to be done. And sometimes we may want to just put our campaign promises on the shelf and forget we made a lot of outlandish statements. But it's an issue that we have to deal with, and Mexico is one of our very most important partners. But Dr. Tony Payan, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.